So I run Autistic Girls Network charity, which, if you don't know it, is a very small charity. We've been a charity for about 2.5 years now, but we've been an organisation for about 6 years. We support autistic girls and their families, which of course also includes autistic women, because autistic children are going to have autistic parents. We mainly support by our Facebook group, which has just about 24,000 people in it. We have lots of website resources. We also run a few face-to-face groups around England, and we offer some post-diagnostic mentoring, which very, very quickly got a huge waiting list, unfortunately. And we have just started to run some peer support groups in Coventry and Warwickshire, because that's where we've got funding for. All of those things we hope to expand as we grow and we get more funding. So if anyone wants to run a marathon or a half marathon or a 5K or a 10K and fundraise for us, then you will help us support that work. So I have my own autistic young people. I used to say autistic teens, but only one of them is still a teen, and she won't be a teen for that much longer. So which makes me feel very old, actually. I'm also neurodivergent myself, and my husband is also autistic. So we are a fully neurodivergent, neurospicy, whatever you like to call it, chaotic family. And actually, if you could see my house, it is very chaotic at the moment. I also wrote a book called Nurturing Your Autistic Young Person, which has lots of lovely reviews on Amazon. And I have a master's in autism, and I have just this week got funding to do my PhD. So that's very exciting and also quite scary. I have experience as a family with CAMS, with intensive support team, social care, EHCPs, flex learning, and specialist schools. And also, actually, I should add to that, neurodivergent child going to university as well, and also dropping out of university. So yeah, experience of all of that. Could I have the next slide, please? If you've seen any of my webinars before, you will recognize this slide. I always put it on just so people understand where I'm coming from with the language that I use. So in Autistic Girls Network, we don't use the term ASD, even though that is what's in the diagnostic manual, because we don't believe that autistic people are disordered or that autism is a disorder. We also don't actually believe that it should be in that diagnostic manual, which is about mental health conditions. Autism or ADHD or any of the neurodivergent co-occurring conditions are not mental health conditions. They're a neurological difference. We also don't use person first language, which is when you say person with autism. We use identity first language, which is autistic person. And the reason for that is a lot of the autistic community feel that saying person with autism makes it sound a bit like an illness. Autism, of course, is not an illness. It's also not something that you can extract from somebody. So it's not like a handbag. You can't pick it up and put it down. It's part of you. It's part of your identity. It's not your whole identity, but it's part of your identity. You've always been autistic since you were born. We also don't use functioning labels, so high functioning, low functioning, levels 1, 2, 3. Just because they're not really particularly helpful in conveying what somebody's support needs are. Autism and the effects on somebody will vary massively day to day. It will vary according to the environment. It will vary according to who they're with and whether they are trusted and they feel safe. It will vary according to whether they feel a bit poorly, whether they're very anxious. All of those things and many more, including a lot of sensory stuff, will make a difference to how somebody is functioning on a day-to-day basis. Really high anxiety, for example, might mean that your executive function is shot and you have real difficulty certainly organizing things, but also if your executive function is, if you're really struggling with it, you can have difficulty stringing a sentence together. So saying somebody is high functioning or low functioning doesn't really convey any of that. So that's why we tend not to use it. Can I have the next slide, please? So what does it mean to be autistic? So everyone, we're all human. We all vary widely. We all have different strengths and different support needs. And autistic and neurodivergent people experience the world in a different way to neurotypical people. Sensory feelings may be felt very much more deeply than non-autistic people, both in a good way and not in a good way. Just because, you know, we have differences in the way that we experience sensory sensitivities, and some of that is good. You know, it can be really fantastic. I think there was, if anybody saw the Chris Packham program about autism, there was one part where he was walking in his favorite place, a wood, and he was walking through that wood, and he was saying, you know, he can see everything, he can experience everything. He knows exactly what's going on in the tree, you know, in the leaves of the trees, in the wind. He can really experience that in a way that perhaps other people can't. However, that kind of inability to be able to filter things out means that some things are difficult for somebody who experiences sensory sensitivities very, very deeply. Can I have the next slide, please? So why is it important to be recognised as autistic? We get a lot of people coming into our Facebook group and saying that people have asked them, could be at school, could be, you know, neighbours, could be family, have asked them, why do you want to label your child or indeed yourself? And I would strongly say that not knowing that you are autistic or neurodivergent can mean that you feel broken because you know that you're different. Every child figures out that they are different to some of their peers, even if they haven't told you, even if they haven't articulated it themselves. They get it, they get that they are different, and as they get older they start to feel more and more different and more broken and more kind of othered by their peers. Not having that label of being autistic or being ADHD or whatever else it might be leads to other labels. It leads to being called sometimes stupid or slow or weird, you know, very, very unpleasant labels. Masking your autism can lead to sometimes really severe mental health issues if you are always trying to be somebody that you're not and desperately trying to fit in. And we will talk more about masking in a little while. Not being recognised means never having your needs met, or if they are met, only accidentally. You can find people who experience the world the same way as you do. You can be kind to yourself. And when I did my master's dissertation, it was about an internal profile of autism. And so a lot of the people that replied to the survey, and that was more than 1,000 people, were late diagnosed autistic women. And this came up time and time again. Learning that they were autistic meant that they could be kind to themselves. Statistically, outcomes for autistic adults are poor, but we haven't had a model of autistic happiness. We don't really know, well, researchers are just beginning to research what autistic happiness means. For an autistic person, quality of life might not mean the same parameters as it does for a neurotypical person. For a start, it might not include being social, and that's a stereotype, but it might not include, you know, going out X times a week. We have to be really careful with those kind of quality of life questions that we ask, because if they're not important to that autistic person, then we're going to get completely the wrong results. You know, we're going to be thinking that their quality of life is good or their quality of life is poor, depending on how they've answered, but actually those questions weren't relevant to them. Increased recognition will also mean increased understanding and hopefully increased support and reasonable adjustments. But we can talk about that. Can I have the next slide, please? So The next few slides after this are going to cover some difficult statistics about being autistic. While your child or the children in your class are growing up, they probably don't have the autonomy or the ability to advocate for themselves in situations outside of the home or their familiar place. So here's why and where they need to have you in their corner, especially with professionals who perhaps, with the best intentions, are trying to do things to them in terms of interventions. Sometimes those interventions are not appropriate, and you need to be their voice, you need to be their advocate, but you can't do that if you don't fully understand what's going on. So it's really important to kind of get that full information. Could I have the next slide, please? So some of these statistics are pretty depressing, I'll be honest with you. Nevertheless, they are real statistics and they are real problems for autistic females particularly, but it doesn't need to be just females. So between 50 to 89% of autistic people have been victimized by someone they know. And this again was something that came up quite a lot in my dissertation. I had a lot of respondents saying, if I had known, I could have protected myself better. If I had known, I would have, perhaps been able to not trust that person who took advantage of me. It's very difficult for autistic people to read people. And so they might need your help advocating with this, though we all know that teenagers always think they know best. So that might not always be easy. But it's definitely something, it's really a recurring theme that comes up again and again. Stigma. There is definitely stigma around being autistic, and there's a relationship between trauma and masking and burnout, autistic burnout. And that is now quite a well-researched, triangle, if you like. And so being aware of autistic burnout, being aware of what it looks like, and most importantly, being aware of how it builds up and what it looks like as it's building up, so you can catch it before it gets to that, the really bad point, is also something that it's really good to understand about. So masking leads to exhaustion, sometimes worse. It's always important, though, to think it's rare for someone to be singly neurodivergent. Anybody, no matter what neurodivergencies we're talking about. And when I say neurodivergencies, I mean autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, OCD, those kind of things, Tourette's. And so now we know that up to 80% of autistic people also have ADHD. But it was only in 2013 that the diagnostic manual changed. Before that, you weren't even allowed to diagnose somebody with both autism and ADHD. So that just goes to show you, doesn't it, how little we really knew. How, do we actually trust research that went before? Because it's only, 11 years ago that you couldn't diagnose somebody with autism and ADHD, and now we know 80% of autistic people have ADHD. So it really makes you distrust past research, and I say that as a researcher. 90% of autistic people have sensory issues. Some, it's going to be more important to them than others. I have 2 autistic children. One of them has sometimes quite extreme, you might say, sensory reactions. The other thinks that he has no sensory sensitivities at all. He does have some, don't we all? But he's certainly very different to my daughter. Children with ADHD are supposed to have received, I don't know how somebody discovered this, but children with ADHD are supposed to receive 20,000 more negative messages than their peers by the age 10. I don't really know how you would research that, but apparently that is the case. We can take the number with a pinch of salt, definitely they are receiving more negative messages. So if your child has ADHD and if they're autistic, it's 80% likely that they do, then being really careful about the messages that they hear and making sure that they hear a lot more positive than negative, where that's in your control, is also really important. And at school, it's really important to remember that that's happening, and for all staff to be aware that that's happening, because we have a lot of unconscious bias, a lot of these things happening without us really noticing. You need to notice what's happening. Autistic women are 20 to 35 times more likely to meet the criteria for anorexia, but there is no national pathway in this country for autism plus eating disorder. They're trying in individual areas, they're trying, but there's no national pathway. SEND pupils are 70% of all permanent exclusions. This has been the case for about 17 years now, and still nothing has been done about it. In fact, I think the figures are actually worse in the last couple of years. So that's also something to be aware of. And if you are a member of school staff, to be fighting against that and to be making sure that that doesn't happen and that needs are met before behaviour escalates to permanent exclusion. And if you're a parent, advocating for your child for their needs to be met, because if that's happening, their needs are not being met. 80% of autistic girls remain undiagnosed after the age of 18. And that is a pretty big statistic. So all of these things lead to inequality, but there are also other health inequalities that exist for neurodivergent people. If I could have the next slide, please. And this is where you really come into your own as an advocate, because a lot of GPs, for example, or staff that work in A&E won't know all that much about neurodiversity. Some will, of course, some individuals will, of course they will. And you can, if you are in hospital, you can ask for the learning disability nurse. That kind of says it all, really, because in the NHS, autism is parceled together with learning disability, even though less than 20% of autistic people have a learning disability, or an intellectual disability, as they call it in the US. But Autistic Doctors International have done a lot of research, and they discovered that 80% of autistic adults reported difficulty in visiting a GP, and that wasn't difficulty because we all have difficulty getting an appointment at a GP. That was difficulty in being able to book, being able to stand waiting in the waiting room, being able to be touched, being able to answer the questions, such as a scale of 1 to 10 in pain, and all of those things being quite difficult for them. It said the highest rated barriers for autistic adults were deciding if symptoms warranted a GP visit, and that was 72%. And difficulty making appointments by telephone was 62%. A lot of you who, if you have autistic young people, or if you're autistic yourself, you may really recognise that reluctance to use the phone. Not feeling understood, and difficulty communicating with their doctor, and also the waiting room environment. They really reported a preference for online or text-based appointment booking facilities, and also online or text-based actual appointments. And of course, in some places you can get that a bit more now. I think the whole pandemic kind of made a difference to that, in a sense. Also, the facility to email in advance the reason for consultation, and a quiet place to wait in the surgery. So those are all things that you can advocate for your young person. Other adverse outcomes and health inequalities are about physical and mental health conditions. So not attending specialist referrals or screening programs because you're too anxious, requiring more extensive treatment, and I do have we are going to have content written by a young woman who, her mum contacted me. I don't know, it must have been about 6 weeks ago, I think. And she really needed to go and have tests because, you know, it was obvious that something was wrong. And probably these things had been wrong for quite a while. She was away at university. She wasn't with her family. She, you know, she didn't tell them until it had got quite bad. But she could not make herself to go and have blood tests. She was really, really anxious about it. She tried. They couldn't, you know, they couldn't get her to have blood tests. Eventually, she was treated quite badly by different A&E units. And then eventually they did find one where staff understood. They made accommodations for her. They took time to understand what her difficulties were, and she did manage to have the tests. Unfortunately, they found out that she had leukemia. And had she been able to, or been accommodated to be able to have these tests earlier, they would have found out earlier. So, you know, these are health inequalities that do really make a difference. And of course, another one would be co-occurring conditions. It's not just neurodivergencies that are common co-occurring conditions. There's also things like hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, fibromyalgia is all more common. And to a lesser extent, epilepsy is all more common. So making sure that those things are understood by health professionals as being, you know, a common co-occurrence is also quite important. I do know a lot of people that have had a lot of difficulty getting Ehlers-Danlos referrals and diagnosis, despite it being, you know, relatively common for autistic and ADHDers. Can I have the next slide, please? So what can we do about it? We've gone through the depressing stuff. What can we do about it? So reduction of these inequalities really understands that healthcare providers and healthcare leaders and you know, each ICB, each health authority understands autistic perspectives, understands autistic communication needs, and sensory sensitivities. And, you know, adjustments for autism specific needs are just as necessary as, you know, for example, ramps for wheelchairs. They need to provide other alternatives to using the phone, and they need to, you know, be more clued up on things like hypermobility and EDS, and also expression of pain. Autistic people do or can, no, I can't say do, it's obviously not all, it's only some, but some autistic people experience pain in a different way to neurotypical people. And what is happening is that professionals are making assumptions based on this neurotypical framework they have and that they've been taught, it's not their fault, where, you know, people who are in pain, for example, make certain facial expressions, or, you know, cry out when they reach a certain level of pain, or, you know, grimace when you press their stomach in a certain place and they're in pain. You can't make those assumptions about autistic people because it doesn't always happen. They may not necessarily have that much control over their facial expressions. If you ask them to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10, they might find that very difficult, because what is 10? You know, what is scale of 10 for pain? How do you know? What if you're already in pain because you have EDS, for example, and hypermobility? What if you live with a level of chronic pain because you've got fibromyalgia? One person's 10 is another person's 24, you know. So those kind of things don't necessarily, and of course I'm generalizing, don't necessarily make sense to autistic people. So it's something that always needs to be bared in mind, and it's something that you can advocate for at health appointments. Right, can I have the next slide, please? So what about in school? So in school, autistic young people may have had their whole school career receiving stigmatizing messages about being autistic, you know, possibly, probably even without people realizing that they were autistic. They may not have even realized they were autistic, but they've heard it all their life. They've also essentially been gaslit because for many years people will have been saying to them, oh, it's not that bright, oh, it's not that noisy, when in fact for them it was that bright, it was that noisy, sometimes to the point of pain. But they have had years of their actual experiences being invalidated by people who don't understand that the world can be experienced in different ways. So that's pretty difficult to deal with. Understanding that is the first step towards changing it. So the messages that they receive are going to really vary in relation to students' other identities, their race, their gender, the colour of their skin, maybe their religion, their culture. All of those are going to be different. And you know, that kind of intersectionality is across the whole of autism research. It's difficult for autistic girls to be diagnosed and to be recognized as autistic. It's even harder if you're black. Um, and there's no getting away from that. It's also can be hard within your own community, if you are, you know, part of a particular community who don't really understand autism or who have a stigma against autism and ADHD. The pupils with SEND are more than twice as likely to be bullied. And in fact, there has been research which showed that autistic, I think up to 80% of autistic pupils, seems to be always 80%, doesn't it, reported having been bullied at school. My son was certainly bullied. My daughter says that she wasn't. Of course, I wasn't there, so I don't know if that's true. But she said she wasn't, which is great. There's also, unfortunately, a very high suicide rate in autistic pupils and a high rate of self-harm. And some of that happens at school. But even if it doesn't happen at school, a lot of it is exacerbated by what happens at school. So being aware of all that is the first step towards stopping it. It's the first step towards fixing it. Can I have the next slide, please? So let's just talk very briefly about autistic masking. And if you've seen, I can't remember which one of my other presentations, the next 3 slides, I think you will have seen before. So I apologize if that's the case. But for those that don't know, autistic masking is also called, well, it's called many things, but among others, called social camouflaging. And it's kind of the social act performed by an autistic person, whether they realize it or not, whether they're conscious of it or not, so that they fit in with their peers. And it often means that they suppress their autistic traits or some of their autistic traits, or they hide the struggles they encounter as being part of a society that's made for neurotypical people. It's not made for neurodivergent people. Some of the possibilities from masking are mental ill health, trauma, and possible PTSD. It tends to be more common in girls, but that is a generalization. Certainly boys and non-binary young people do mask, and can have an internal profile of autism, which won't be picked up so early because it doesn't have that external behavior. It doesn't have, it's not disrupting people, and so it doesn't get referred so quickly. Situational mutism can really go hand in hand with it, and so by that I mean feeling so unsafe that you don't feel able to talk. And by unsafe, I mean emotionally unsafe. I don't mean you think that someone's going to punch you or anything. I mean emotionally unsafe. The other term for it is selective mutism, but I don't use that because situational mutism is really, really caused by anxiety, totally driven by anxiety. So it's not a choice. Anxiety-led school absence quite often is what happens after a lot of masking because of mental ill health. But it can be really complex, and it can be really changeable, and it can change according to the environment and according to who you're with and according to whether you feel safe to show your autistic traits and you feel safe to be yourself. A lot of people have said that, a lot of parents have told me that after their child got their diagnosis, they suddenly seemed more autistic. And that's really common. Certainly that's what happened with our daughter. She was diagnosed when she was 13. And after a while, when she became more comfortable to kind of let it all out, I suppose, at home, yes, she definitely became, or looked like she was becoming more autistic. Of course, she wasn't becoming more autistic. She'd always been autistic. But what she was doing was she was dropping the mask, and she was, being comfortable to be herself, being comfortable to use her regulation techniques, which some of them might, appear as an autism trait, like stimming, for example, repetitive movements. And that's perfectly normal, perfectly common. It's a healthy thing to happen. You want them to be able to drop the mask in a place where they're comfortable. Some people, especially some autistic adults who've been masking all their life, will never completely drop the mask. And that's okay, as long as they're happy with it, that's okay. But it is really exhausting to mask. So it's great if you can create an environment where somebody doesn't have to mask, then, obviously that's the ideal. It's unlikely to happen at school. Perhaps if you were in a group that felt really safe, and that you felt like people understood you, and hopefully you might have some friends that really understand you, then you might feel able to, but a lot of them won't feel like they can, because they've grown up thinking that they really have to fit in or something terrible will happen. And also, even before people are diagnosed, the bullies are very good at recognizing people who are different, and so they might have already been singled out, and so they desperately don't want to be singled out again. Can I have the next slide, please? I think we've kind of covered this, but I'm making hand movements. I don't know if you can see me. We've kind of covered this. Masking is a survival technique. It helps you to feel more normal. It helps you to fit in with your peers and your friendship groups. It actually also helps you to make friends. It's not all a bad thing. A lot of autistic people have said they need to mask to make friends, and some of them to keep friends. I can't say that I think it's a very good thing to be able to have to mask to be able to keep friends, but I can see why it would be a technique that you might use if that was kind of a weapon in your arsenal, to avoid being thought less of. And we've talked about the stigma of being autistic, and to avoid any negative attention. And we're back to the bullying again. Can I have the next slide, please? So how do you spot it? Well, if your child is exploding once they get home, then that's a good indicator that they may have been trying to hold it in all day, and once they can't manage anymore, it all comes out. Situational mutism, as we've talked about, being very quiet in class and never putting your hand up. Of course, that's not an indicator on its own, but with other things, it could be an indicator. The fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, trauma response, that last response, the fawn response, which is kind of saying what you think people want to hear, doing what people want you to do, even though you don't want to, that is in itself a form of masking. And having difficulty working collaboratively, recognizing and managing conflict, being very difficult, those are kind of autistic traits, really, rather than specifically masking. But all of those things together would make me think of masking. Can I have the next slide, please? So why is it important that you understand, or your young person, or you, if you're autistic, understand and embrace your autistic identity? Well, I've already talked about, feeling different your whole life. And so many people have expressed the relief that they felt being diagnosed. That won't always be the case if you're, you know, say they're a teen when they're diagnosed, because there's stigma attached to that, and you don't want to stand out, and so it's difficult. It's a difficult balance. Knowing your needs and strengths and finding out your needs and strengths means that you can get your needs met, and you can start doing the things that you have suppressed, like stimming. You can use these regulation techniques to help you, and you can also manage your day, manage your energy, which is going to stop you feeling quite so exhausted all the time. So all of those things are really important, as well as finding other people who experience the world the same way as you do, when you felt so alone and you felt so different, and perhaps you felt broken up to that point. That can't really be expressed enough, and it's one of the things that parents talk about from the girls in our face-to-face groups, is just having that kind of company that understands you is really important for them. Can I have the next slide, please? So now we're going to talk about energy accounting and managing energy, because this is a really important part of how you can nurture your autistic young person. And the idea looks at energy as if it's in a bank account. So if you withdraw more than you deposit, you go into the red. You need to understand what constitutes a withdrawal, though, for your young person, and how your young person can make deposits. And those things are going to be different for every individual. If it's easier, you can think of it in terms of a battery charging and emptying. Can't remember what word you use. It's not emptying, is it? But you know what I mean. Can I have the next slide, please? So how can you help? What can you do to help people balance their energy accounting books? Well, what you can do is you can sit down with your young person, or a young person that you're working with at school, and you can figure out for them individually what helps them. And they might not necessarily know this if they've only been recently diagnosed, because if they were diagnosed late, there might have been quite a lot of, you know, they may have been in crisis. But, you know, figure out what helps them. What do they really like doing? What brings them joy? And it might be their special interest. It might be listening to music on headphones. It might be pacing up and down. It might be swinging on a swing, or on, you know, an egg chair or something. It might be rocking on one of those peanut balls. You know, it could be anything, and it's going to be entirely individual. I could sit here for the next hour and tell you things that it might be, and they might not relate to your young person that you're talking about. So it's something that you really have to figure out with them. And then thinking about what triggers them. What do they find really difficult? And again, that is going to be wildly individual. School often figures on the list, but it might not figure for everybody, and there might be other things that are even harder than school, you know. And there are wildly different things, and I think we're going to see some of them in the next slide. And then think about what soothes them. What can they do, or what do they do, because they may have already figured out some of their own strategies unconsciously, possibly. What soothes them? So for my daughter, what really helps her, and what she has to do multiple times a day, is she listens to music on a headphone and she paces up and down in our garden, and that soothes her. Or we take her for a drive. And when she was at her most anxious, that was every night for an hour. We had to take her out for a drive. But, you know, it's going to be different for every person. Going for a drive is often a good one, because of the way that it soothes one of our particular senses. And so it often can work well, but it just depends on the individual, what you like best. You know, do you want a rocking movement, in which case you might like going on a swing? Do you, want particular noise, in which case it might be music, or it might be doing both at the same time, who knows? And then thinking about how can you predict what triggers are going to turn up in the week? You know, let's say you're looking at your diary. You are figuring out what does this young person have happening this week. So at least some things you can plan for. Of course, we can't always plan for triggers. Things happen. You know, we have to deal with them. Sometimes they're too overwhelming and we melt down or shut down. But some things we can plan for. So at least we can look through the week and we can think, okay, on Wednesday, he has to go to the dentist. He hates the dentist. It makes him really anxious. You know, he really worries about it. What can we do to make the rest of the week more chilled out for him? And, you know, it's recognizing that going to the dentist is going to use a lot of emotional energy. How can we build up that emotional energy again? So can we have the next slide, please? So first of all, we're going to look at energy withdrawals. So what are the things that might be difficult? And again, this is just a selection. We could probably have 10 slides about this and they'd all have different things on. But so some of the things that might be difficult are socializing or peopling, as I call it, especially people that you don't know. And that can take a lot of energy. Change to the routine, especially if it hasn't been adequately prepared for, can be very difficult. School can be very difficult. Difficult sensory environments, so lots of noise that you can't filter out, you know, lots of smells that aren't pleasant, being in school corridors with lots of people touching you, all of those things might be difficult. Having a conflict or being told off or being corrected, if we think that up to 80% of autistic people also have ADHD. A very common trait of ADHD is something called RSD, which stands for rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And basically it means finding it really difficult to be told off, finding it really difficult to be told that you're wrong. And so that, you know, that could well be happening as well. Hyper empathy is a big thing for especially my cohort of late diagnosed autistic girls. But a lot of autistic people have tons of empathy. It's a complete myth that autistic people don't feel empathy. And some autistic people take on the feelings of other people in the room. They're so empathetic. And so that can be difficult to deal with. It can be very overwhelming. It can be very exhausting. Injustice. So I think it should be part of the diagnostic criteria of autism that autistic people tend to be really have a strong sense of social justice. And so injustice is difficult to deal with. It's felt very, you know, you have really big feelings about injustice. And so that can be hard, that can be quite exhausting. Having unstructured time, it's a difficult one, this one, isn't it? Some people won't mind having unstructured time, especially if they have the autonomy to do what they want in it. But unstructured time where you don't have the autonomy or it's not in your house can be quite difficult because you're not really sure what you're supposed to be doing. You're not really sure what to expect. And uncertainty equals anxiety for autistic people in general. So masking may drain your energy, and social rules that you don't really understand can also be quite draining, especially if you get into trouble about them. Feeling excluded by your peers can be draining, and if we're talking about executive function, multitasking can be really hard and can lead to cognitive overload. So those are just some of them. And then if we go to the next slide, we can talk about deposits into your energy bank account. I'm sorry there's a lot of words on these slides. I just thought it would be easier for you to be able to see them rather than me just saying them. So deposits might be your passionate interests, whether that's doing things about them or talking about them to people. Just one of the things that I could say about nurturing your autistic young person, if there's just one thing that you take away from this, special interests are so important to your autistic person. or you if you're autistic. So important. Try as much as you can to validate them, to be interested in them, or at least to give them time to talk about them, um, and not to dismiss them, and not to kind of poo-poo them, and not to let other people do that either, because they are so important and they bring such joy. My son, really, he would say he doesn't have any sensory sensitivities, but he certainly has a passionate interest, and it is to do with Star Wars armor, specifically, or it used to be specifically Mandalorian armor. And for years, he has wanted to join. Um, they're called legions, but it's kind of cosplay societies. But it has, and the costume, the cosplay armor, has to be film. What do they call it? Accurate, film accurate, I suppose. And so it has to pass certain, it has to be passed by the Legion commander or whatever they're calling it. And he desperately wanted to join one. And this year he managed to join one. So it's like the best thing that could ever have happened to him. And he has been to three, I suppose they're, well, events, I suppose you would call them. And he has been a stormtrooper, and he's been a crew member helping other stormtroopers. And it is the best thing that he's ever done. They're probably all autistic. They're all male and they're probably all autistic. But who knows? It doesn't matter. He's really happy doing that. Now, I have to say his special interest is particularly narrow. But either way, it's really important to give him space to talk about it, and eventually to do it if that's possible. Other deposits might be predictability, or some kind of structure with autonomy to make choices, being consistent, keeping promises, chill out time alone, stimming, and that could be, well, it could be literally anything, but it could be rocking on your chair, it could be saying the same words in your head, it could be singing the same song, it could be watching the same TV program over and over again. Doesn't matter what it is, but for that person, that's what they need. Could be good sensory input, whatever is good for them, whether it's music, whether it's going for a walk in the woods, doesn't matter. Good proprioceptive inputs. Proprioception is one of our senses, and it's about like movement in the body, how we feel when our body moves. And that's what things like swinging and driving is all about. That's why the feeling of going for a drive is good proprioceptive input for somebody that seeks that kind of sensory input. Animals. It's rare. In my experience, it's rare to find autistic children that don't like some animals, at least. And for many of them, that sensation of stroking and cuddling an animal can be really, really important. When my daughter is in meltdown, sometimes the dogs can calm her down. Having plenty of sleep and chill time built into your routine is important. And again, watching favorite TV shows, playing favorite games, whether they do it over and over again, is also really important, and really good at building back up that energy deposit. Can I have the next slide, please? I've just realised what the time is. We might have to skip a few slides, Helen. And this was an example of the girl, and I say girl because she was a girl when she thought of this. I think she was a teen when she came up with this. She's Australian, and this was her original example activity. Those are the things that she liked to do and that she didn't like to do, and she gave them points. So going to school was 90 points. That's how bad it was for her. It was the highest score. And if you look down, there's some others that are 90 points as well. And then the deposits, that she gave them points. So reading for her was 90 points. So if she went to school, she needed to do some reading to build up that energy again, or she needed to pick a few of them to build up 90 points worth of energy. So of course you don't have to be that precise, but what we are aiming for is a week where you are roughly balancing your withdrawals and your deposits. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, Maya used a battery analogy, so things that recharged her battery and things that used up her energy. Can I have the next slide? And again, this is just an example because everyone is going to have different needs, different triggers, and they're going to have different ways to self-regulate. But just an example, you know, thinking about a higher goal, and quite often that might be used for things like revision and stuff. The higher goal is obviously getting through the exam and getting a good mark. Acknowledging that it's hard, identifying the sensory issues which cause trouble so that you can avoid them. For the parent or for the school member of staff, it's important to kind of monitor what's happening, but not to interfere unless it's really necessary, but to provide options for them to self-soothe. So somewhere they can go to chill out or to pace, perhaps apps on their mobile phone, or things like stress balls or fidget toys or other things that they can physically use. And identifying sensory or other rewards that they can give themselves, which can help to soothe them, is a really important part of regulation. Can I have the next slide, please? And then I'll figure out what we need to skip. So I think we'll end here. How can you help in school? Well, you can think about what you've noticed, signs that you've noticed, things that we've talked about, things about masking. Are any of the young people in your class exhibiting those signs? You can think about what seems to help them. You know, if they have a situation where they found it difficult before, what's different this time? Why are they finding it easier? You can think about the triggers in school. What you can do is you can walk around your school with some of your identified autistic pupils and asking them, kind of doing a sensory audit, asking them, you know, what are the difficult places? What do you find difficult in this room? What do you find difficult in this corridor? And identifying those triggers so that hopefully you can do something about it, or at least you can make allowances if, you know, perhaps behavior that's distressed happens in those environments, and you can say, okay, I know what triggered that. And how can you change the environment and the attitudes of people around you? It's really important as part of advocating for your young person and nurturing your young person, that as much as possible you surround them with people that understand them, or that at least let them be and don't try to invalidate their experiences. How can you do that? It's not always simple, certainly at school, because there are so many people in a secondary school. There's so many people, so many members of staff. It's hard, but in the home environment, it is possible, and it is up to you to put barriers in place, if need be, around attitudes that aren't helpful, and around people that aren't helpful. And again, that's something individual, and that's something that's up to you. But I think we're gonna skip the next slide, Helen, and the next one, and we are going to just go to the ways to nurture a positive autistic identity. So I think that's a good one to finish with. So we've already talked about surrounding your child or your young adult even with people who understand and support them. Give them as much autonomy as possible. Autonomy is really important to autistic young people, especially when you remember, and it's good to always remember, that they may have been invalidated a lot. And so giving them that understanding, validating what they're saying, listening to them is really important. Promote independence, perhaps in a scaffolded way. So kind of independence with training wheels, I suppose you might say. Enable self-regulation all the time. So you've figured out what they need to self-regulate, make sure that that's in place and that they have access to it. There's lots of apps that you can use that assist executive function if needed. There's Brain in Hand. That's very expensive, but you can get it on things like DSA, Disabled Students Allowance. You can get it in EHCPs. There's also something called TIMO, TIIMO, which can help. But, essentially, TIMO is kind of setting up alarms on your phone to remind you to do things. So you could do that yourself, really. Understanding masking and understanding self-care is really important. You might want to encourage a diary or a journal or drawing even if your young person has difficulty with expressing emotions, if they're alexithymic, which is basically what that is, having difficulty identifying and expressing emotions, finding other ways to kind of let you know what's going on is a good idea. Promoting self-advocacy and empowerment of that young person is always important. Promoting neurodiversity in general, and teaching them how to resolve conflict, because it may not be something that comes automatically. It may need a little bit of help. Really important, enabling boundaries. So you can't teach them autonomy, you can't teach them to self-advocate for themselves and then refuse the boundaries that they put up. So if they put up boundaries, if they say no to something, then unless, some things you can't let happen, but as long as it's reasonable, enable them to put up those boundaries and respect them and make other people respect them, which is just as important. So if you're neurotypical, I would like you to consider that the way that you think is the right way is not necessarily the right way, but it's one of many right ways. It's the majority way. And this is really important because once you've come to terms with that idea, once you can completely accept that other people experience the world in a different way to you, it opens your mind to all kinds of possibilities, and it will help you accept difference, and it will help you figure out what's going on with your autistic young person. So if you'd like to read more about an internal profile of autism, it's not just about girls, although it says it on the cover. It's about an internal profile, and how it's often missed or even misdiagnosed, frequently to things like personality disorder for women particularly. Then that's available freely on our website, and you can download it on our website from that link, or you can just go to our website and there's a downloads tab, and that is on there, and also a reasonable adjustments document is on there too, and a hospital passport and a school or home education passport too. This is my book, which is available in all good bookshops. Actually, might not be available in bookshops, but certainly available in online bookshops. And if you want to know more about nurturing your autistic young person, then there's obviously a lot more in there. There's 80,000 words in there, so that will keep you going for a little while. And then there's just links to our website, which are probably already on the handout that you're going to get. So we can stop sharing.